The Fryske Akademy, the organisation responsible for looking into all things Frisian, just published a huge new survey about language in Friesland. And I wanted to make a video about this and look at what are its implications for the Frisian language. This survey is called Taal van Friesland, een nije koers by Susanne Dekkers et al. This is very cool because when I was studying at the Fryske Akademy doing an internship, I shared a desk with Susanne Dekkers. So very amazing to see that she's been doing great research together with her colleagues. Now this research is available in Frisian. It is linked in the comments below and I would highly recommend you to check it out. But of course, many people don't read Frisian, but they might watch this video instead. So I thought I'd make an English language overview of the contents of this survey, also looking at some of the explanations as to why we're seeing the current language trends in Friesland, and then what the future holds for Frisian based on this study. The long and short of it is, Frisian is doing pretty good. It's in a stable situation, and indeed, it's gaining ground in certain areas too, which is very interesting. This study asked as one of its questions, how many people speak Frisian as a first language? And it came back, as with many other surveys that have been done, into the answer that Frisian is the main language, the first language of 53.2% of Friesland's inhabitants. Several other languages specific to Friesland are also represented. City Frisian spoken in the cities like Ljouwert, Dokkum, Heinz, Starum, Friesland, and many more. This is technically a variety of Dutch, but with strong Frisian influences, was given around 5%. Bilsk, which is spoken in het Bild, an area in the northwest, is also technically a variety of Dutch, but a contact variety that has had lots of Frisian influence, is spoken by 1.7%, and Stellingwaafs, which is spoken in the very south of Friesland, borders the Low German speaking area, is a Low German variety that has also had Frisian influence on it, is spoken by around 2% of respondents. What's interesting is that people could also choose to say other, that they spoke a different language, and when researchers looked into the language variety that people gave up as the language they spoke, they actually found that the largest category were people who spoke Low German, the variety spoken in the neighbouring province of Groningen. So this is cross-border migration. And the second largest category were people who gave up special names for city Frisian languages, so like Leeuwarders or Dokkumers from Ljouwert and from Dokkum. So this suggests actually that the city Frisian category should be slightly larger than it is now. The rest of that other category appears to be from migration, as with those who speak English, around 2.3%. They also looked at where Frisian is actually spoken within Friesland. I'm not sure exactly how they divided it up, but they've divided Friesland into quarters, so I'm not sure where those borders lie, as well as a separate research area in the capital Ljouwert, and then the Wadeiland and the islands above Friesland. And there they could see that there are clear differences between how many people speak Frisian in each area. The strongest Frisian-speaking area appeared to be in Noord-East Friesland, which is northeast Friesland, where well over the majority of people reported Frisian as a first language. Everywhere else in Friesland spoke a relatively similar level of Frisian, around 50%, apart from the Wadeiland and the islands, where traditionally Island Frisian was the main variety, but that has been largely displaced by Dutch. The capital, Ljouwert, as many people suspected, is largely Dutch-speaking. However, there is a very significant Frisian-speaking minority there, people that reported speaking the language, at just around 33%. So this is interesting because it shows that even though Ljouwert is considered to be very anti-Frisian a lot of the time, very negative in its attitudes, there is still quite a significant Frisian minority there. So even if you're in the cities, there will be 1 in 3 people who will speak Frisian. There was also a clear divide more generally between rural and urban areas, where rural people were more likely to speak Frisian. Rural areas have more Frisian speakers than urban areas. What's also interesting, of course, is that in that study, many people could say that they had both Dutch and Frisian as a first language. And this is then something that researchers have looked at in connection with how people answered questions later on, for instance, on how well they speak Frisian and their attitudes towards Frisian to gain further insights, how that linguistic background also impacts their other attitudes towards Frisian. They also looked at, is Frisian being taught at school, seeing as that since 1980 it is a legal requirement for schools in Friesland to teach Frisian at various levels, at least in primary education. That means it's very concerning to see that of those who responded under the age of 29, around 30% said that they had never been taught any Frisian in school. Now, a slight nuance here is that on the Vat-eilanden, it isn't compulsory for Frisian to be taught at school, given that there's very low numbers of speakers there, traditionally their own island varieties of Frisian, and in part of the Stellingwerve. But there is no way that this constitutes 30% of the Frisian population. So this is clearly an area where there needs to be, which needs to be looked at and needs to be rectified. There was also a very significant distinction that students who grew up rurally were much more likely to get more education in Frisian than those who grew up in urban environments. This might also be down to the fact that there are more Frisian speakers in rural areas, so perhaps schools are more equipped to have more teachers who can teach Frisian, and that students themselves can get more out of Frisian. But again, that reinforces this rural-urban divide, where actually if there were more Frisian teachers, more Frisian hours in urban areas, these numbers would increase as well. The study also looked at how Frisian's language skills were and whether these had improved since the last time. This table shows the difference in those who understand, speak, read and write Frisian and who responded either well or very well. So this isn't a total number of people or a percentage of people in Friesland. This is based on skill level. And what we can see if we look right back to 1969 is a broad trend where before the 70s numbers were generally higher, and that during the 70s and into the 80s this dipped quite significantly as televisions, radio became much more popular. This was followed by a period of, let's say, stabilization in the 90s up to the mid-90s when in 1993 Frisian television was introduced, and then a period of great growth up to the first decades of the 21st century, and then now we're looking at the 2025 study to see how things have gone on in the last 3/4 of a decade. So if we look in terms of speaking, we can see that this trend has actually gone down slightly as we've come into 2025. And researchers noted that the group in which less Frisian is being spoken is the youngest group. So this is quite concerning, obviously, given that the future of minority languages is with young people who will grow up and teach their children. But at the same time, this shouldn't be blown out of proportion. This is a 5% decrease since 2018, and there were some questions about the 2018 study that may have overrepresented the number of Frisian speakers. So possibly this is actually a data question rather than a big change. And as we can see, it's very stable and isn't anything like the decrease that was seen over the 70s. What is very encouraging is the fact that in terms of both reading and later with writing as well, there has been an increase and a continuing growth in the number of Frisians who reported that they could read Frisian well or very well. This was also seen in writing, although this is much, much lower, which has been quite a concern for a while, that the vast majority of Frisians can't actually write well in their own language, which relegates the position of Frisian to that of a spoken language alone. And this is one of the biggest factors when it comes to minority languages preservation, that when people are reading and writing in the language gains far more prestige. And so people are much more likely to view it highly, to give it a high status, and indeed to pass it on. And it also signals to people coming into communities, this is a language that is written down, that has a standardization, and it fights against the idea that this is simply a kind of dialect or a defective form of Dutch, which is an unfortunately commonly held position, as you will see if you look at my Twitter account. In general, though, the message is that Frisian is stable and doing well, especially when we look at other minority languages in Europe, many of which are unfortunately in decline. Frisian can't be said to be in decline, and actually is a stable base that is growing in the area of literacy, of reading and writing, which, as mentioned, is an important area for growth. Some interesting trends about those more likely to be capable in writing and in reading Frisian are that they correlate with those who speak Frisian as a first language, which might be expected, but also that women actually generally self-assess themselves to be better in literacy in Frisian than men. They were also more likely to come from rural areas, which, as we've seen, correlates well with where people speak Frisian and where schooling is done in Frisian, as well as having been taught Frisian at school, having a higher education, and generally this trend was also that elderly people were more likely to report being good at writing and reading in Frisian. So there's been a shift of slightly older people that are reading and writing more in Frisian, while there is a slight decline, again a slight decline of a few percentage points of younger people speaking Frisian, while those who said that they could understand Frisian well is around the same as it was. Another important side to language preservation and the future of Frisian is how people feel about the Frisian language. Yeah, trust the humanities to talk about feelings, but actually the facts here are quite important because research has shown that attitudes towards minority languages are very important for their preservation and continuation into the future. The results showed, not entirely unexpectedly, that those who considered themselves to be in the Frisian-speaking category, Frysktalig was the language that was used, were the most positive about Frisian. Those who considered to be mixed First Dutch and Frisian language were largely positive, although slightly more mixed than those who considered themselves to be first language Frisian, and the first language Dutch people were the most negative towards Frisian. So this is a sort of in-group, out-group bias in a kind of way, which is quite interesting, but there's some more data attached to this, and this is explained in the article. It says that of note is that in terms of reading, those who self-reported a low level of reading ability, non-existent, had significantly more negative attitudes than all other participants. That means that people who say they can't read Frisian believe the language to be of less value than those who can read it. And this was done by cross-referencing the answers in the survey, which is why it's so important to do research like this. And it also shows that the fact that the number of people that are reading in Frisian is increasing is a very good sign for the language and the language attitudes. So, as well as correlating with those who can read and write in Frisian, another interesting point of analysis is that men actually viewed Frisian more positively than women did in general. And indeed, that younger people were more likely to have positive attitude towards Frisian and its ability to help integrate people into society. Solidarity with Frisian speakers is actually higher among younger people than in older generations. So that is actually a very positive change that is being seen. It's particularly interesting then that actually what your first language is doesn't correlate strongly with what your opinion is about the Frisian language, your attitude towards it. As they say, a notable observation from the results in general is that growing up with Frisian, in other words, having Frisian as a first language, does not explain the difference in attitudes, but the self-identified language group does. So how one identifies themselves as a Frisian speaker belonging to a Frisian speaking group, even if that is as a second language, was far more important in attitude. So this is again a kind of showing how identity, how social factors are greatly influencing minority languages themselves. There was also a distinction between different areas again. It won't surprise anyone to know that Ljouwert in general, the capital, which is often famous for being quite anti-Frisian, did indeed have a lower attitude towards Frisian than other areas. The most positive area was again Friesland, which, as we saw, a largely rural area, though not exclusively, had also the best access to education in Frisian. So we can see that these things are actually very strongly connected, while many people in Ljouwert responded that they hadn't had Frisian at school. And that's also why it's very frustrating when certain YouTubers who want to show the Frisian language go to Ljouwert and say, hey, nobody here speaks Frisian. People are annoyed when I ask, looking at you. Where is Frisian used? In what situations is it used? Well, many studies have shown that Frisian in general is strongest in more private settings, so in the home and being spoken with children. Now, this is something that people have tried to change to try and get more Frisian in public and certainly in official roles, as this again gives status to the language, which is important for preservation. But one really positive thing that this study showed is that more and more younger parents of the younger generation are speaking Frisian with their children. And this was something that older generations, again related to the status of the language, believed it was better if they only spoke Dutch with their children, which of course eventually leads to language death, as then no one passes on the language. But now that trend seems to be reversing, where more and more young people, young parents, are speaking Frisian with children so that they grow up in a Frisian language environment and continue the language on. This is one of the big differences with an area like Groningen, or the Low German-speaking area, both in the Netherlands and in Germany, where several generations ago, most of the time, the grandparents' generation was still raised in Low German, but they decided to stop speaking Low German with their children. And now my generation, those in their 20s, hardly anyone speaks Low German at all. This is completely different to Friesland, where thankfully many of the parents, grandparents continue to speak Frisian with their children. And that's why we now see that Frisian is still the first language of most people in Friesland, but this Low German variety is now dwindling in the percentages in Groningen, which is a great shame. How can Frisian be further strengthened in the future? The survey also gave a few pointers where they believe that they could focus on to continue strengthening Frisian in the future. Now, one of these, which we've discussed quite a bit already, is to boost literacy, reading and writing. The writing percentage is around 19% who can write Frisian well is very low, and obviously it's great if we could get that number up, more people writing Frisian. That also then leads to the third pointer, which is more visibility of Frisian. Zichtbaarheid is what it's called in Frisian, and that basically means having more Frisian in public, because one thing that is true is that while most people can't write very well in Frisian, it means that they are taught to write in Dutch, and so a lot of signage, official information, things in public are all written in Dutch, even if they speak Frisian in their daily lives. So that would also help to reinforce that. Another is to provide more resources for child rearing, raising children in the Frisian language, supporting and fostering that trend that is going on where more and more parents are raising their children in Frisian so that the language continues. Another factor that's important, of course, is government support and making sure that Frisian is represented in levels of local government to ensure that that status continues. And finally, as the research bore out, identity is also a key factor in attitude. And so giving a strong identity to the Frisian language and looking at how it treats with new migration into the province of both people from other parts of the Netherlands and different parts of the world, and how they can belong to a Frisian identity to ensure that they also see the value in learning Frisian and becoming part of the speech community are key issues for the future. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been interesting. Do check out my channel Frisian with Hilbert if you are interested in finding out about more Frisian things. I have a lot of discussions there, and I will hopefully be able to do some interviews with people doing some research, maybe even some of the researchers who looked into this. If you speak Frisian, if you read Frisian, and I've just seen the data, so I know that statistically some of you will be able to read Frisian, then go and check that out in the description below. Anyway, until the next time, I've been Hilbert en dit weer het Frysk. Het weer eigenlijk geen geschiedenis, dit weer echt heel recente geschiedenis. Ik zou het de taalkunde nemen. Maar ja, dank u wel voor het zien en ik zorg je hem de andere keer wel.